Bryan, thanks for coming to the Disruptors. Let's talk education because I know that's your background. What's your story quickly, and then let's jump into what the future of education actually looks like.
Mark, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. Sorry, there's a lag for a second. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, actually, it looks like I may have lost connectivity for a few seconds, but I'm back now. That was odd.
That was odd. Let me turn the bandwidth down, and then we'll just restart. We'll restart that. I goof it up. Technology goofs it up. Now, hopefully, we're good. You ready? No, you're frozen again. Yeah, you're there now.
I'm gonna make sure I kill every conceivable tab right now.
If that doesn't work, I'll switch it to just audio mode.
No, let's try and
tried and true. Something like that. Could be worse. It could be Skype.
Well, how do you like Hangout right now in 2019?
I feel like the companies kind of put in the effort and then kind of stopped with all the good stuff after they got it to work. And I think it's pretty obvious. I like Zoom the best, but they have the lowest quality for audio. So unfortunately, we have to use Hangouts. And Skype, every time it updates, it breaks itself.
Oh, good. Progress.
The Microsoft way.
Yep.
Okay. You ready to do this?
I'm still ready. Let's try it again.
Okay. This will be a take 3. This is Disruptors Take 3, where we get awesome people on and try our best to have incredible conversations. I know we're going to do it this time because we got Bryan Alexander on the program. Thanks for coming.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So, Bryan, I know there's a lot that you've talked about. You're a futurist. You're an educator. Talk to me about what the big puzzle is that's on your mind today. What keeps you up at night? What are you most focused on?
Mostly I'm focused on, it's going to sound kind of dry, but on the sustainability of American higher education, trying to figure out if we can keep the colleges and universities alive through the rest of the 21st century.
I would say there's not a chance unless it's just so expensive. Let's dive into that a little bit. What's the most broken in your opinion?
Well, one thing that's broken is that we designed contemporary higher education for the 1960s and 70s. And it was a really great system for that. And then we did things to it and our society changed. And now the system doesn't really fit anymore. So we're trying to figure out how to redesign the system. And that's a really hairy, complicated subject. That's a deep, deep problem with all kinds of challenges.
And if I gave you a magic wand, what would your solution look like, at least today?
I'd wave it a few times. One solution would be to help colleges and universities that are now focused on teaching 18-year-olds to be able to teach older people because our population is aging. We're not alone in this. Every developed nation is aging, some faster than others, but we really need to pivot on that. A second would be to, we don't have a good answer for this, but to figure out a better business model. Right now, a lot of higher education is based on either, well, primarily on financialization, where students take out enormous loans that are just growing in size. And within colleges, we can get pretty nerdy in the details here if you want, but they have this financial system that's kind of like buying, it's about as transparent as healthcare or air travel. We have published tuition that is usually not what is charged. People usually pay something like half of what's published. And so we have to figure out a way to make college pricing more transparent. If I wave that wand another way, I would increase our ability to teach with and about technology. We've made some progress in that, but we need to do more and more of that. And another would be to boost resources to most of higher education. We have the biggest sector in higher ed. Well, let me ask, Mark, what's the biggest chunk of higher ed in the US right now? What would you say?
The admin.
In terms of population, yeah, that's quite true. That's quite true. But I was thinking in terms of institutions. I'll come back to admin in a second, but community colleges are the biggest, and they have almost no money, and they do tremendous work. Second biggest are state institutions, state colleges and universities, and they've been defunded by state governments. The past 30 years, we've increased the number of students going through college and university, but we've decreased the amount that colleges and universities receive in order to be able to pay for all that. So we hence loans, hence the huge student loan debacle. So we got to figure out a way to give those institutions that do all this incredible work more support. To go back to admin, I mean, the biggest growth area in higher education has been admin. And admin means something peculiar in higher education. It means anybody on a campus who isn't a professor and isn't a student. So it means presidents, it means custodians, it means librarians, it means technologists, it means media people, it means security officers. I mean, it means the whole schmear. And a lot of that grew for really, really good reasons. I mean, IT, for example, our IT needs are much larger than they were 20 years ago. So we have more staff. There's a lot of federal and state regulations that require more and more help. We have a lot of needs that have emerged, especially in student life. And on top of that, there is some degree of empire building, some degree of feather bedding. There are a lot of stories, a lot of scandals that we can point to, but admin as such is really enormous. At the same time, we grew the number of faculty, but most of what we grew was adjunct faculty. Should I explain that?
Yeah, what's adjunct?
Adjunct means someone who is hired on a per semester basis, hired and fired on a per semester basis. So we'll hire you to teach a class on podcasting 101, and we'll pay you maybe, say, $1,500 to do it. You won't have any healthcare. You won't have any retirement. You won't have any job security. At any point in the semester, we can just fire you. At the end of the semester, we may or may not decide to bring you back for another $1,500. The majority of faculty in the United States are adjunct. Tenured and tenure-track faculty are a minority and a shrinking minority.
So many becoming Uber drivers, essentially.
Basically, and sometimes quite literally. Either that we have adjuncts who also drive Uber or Lyft in order to try to pay money to stay above poverty. Most of them can't, or I'm sorry, a lot of them can. We also have adjuncts who move from college to college. So they'll teach podcasting 101 here, drive 40 minutes to go to another place and teach audio design there, drive 50 minutes to go someplace else and then teach Western Civ 101. And then their office is usually Starbucks or maybe their car. That's the normative faculty member in the United States right now. If I can wave a magic wand and change that, that'd be one of the first things I'd do.
How much of the problem with higher education bubble, so to speak, is just the fact that the government tried to do the right thing by making these cheap student loans, which kind of created the perennial piggy bank, so to speak, of the kids can go to get that, and the schools then have no incentive to bring costs down. They are incentivized to grow for growth's sake.
I think there's a little bit of truth to that, but not too much. So what you described is, starting in the 60s and 70s, we had this huge redesign of higher ed. I mean, that's when we bulked out a lot of state systems. That's when we grew the community college system in huge ways. That's when the federal government took over a role in putting out loans and support. And that's when we decided as a nation that we need to get more and more people through colleges and universities. And we've been doing that ever since, which is really extraordinary and a great thing.
That's actually a follow-up. Do you think too many people are going to college? Because I would argue that yes. Well,
let's come back to that question. That's a really, really deep and a very, very good question. So part of the problem is, for some degree, for some institutions, for some years, yes, they didn't have an incentive to keep costs down because they could rely on federal loans. The problem, though, with that is that the costs became a huge moment of cultural anxiety about 15 years ago. And that's never stopped. A lot of state governments have taken action to either freeze college tuition for public universities, or they've pushed through, like in New York, for example, or Tennessee, some form of public support for tuition. There's also the fact that a lot of the cost increases are kind of irrelevant to the loans. There are a few great economists, like Michael Feldman, for example, who argue pretty convincingly that if you want to hire faculty and you want to hire administration, you have to pay for them. It's like hiring a dentist, or a lawyer. These are jobs that require some significant degree of training and education, if not PhD, master's level. That's a lot of work, and those jobs usually don't come free. We have other cost problems as well, depending on the institution. Some have a physical plant that has to be maintained and often has to be improved, and that's costly. And on top of that, one of the secret costs that drives every administrator I know crazy is healthcare. Healthcare costs are just ballooning all over the US. So a lot of money goes for that. On top of that, we want to have more and more college students, right? We want to have more and more students experiencing more and more classes. That's terrific. It costs money. You have to hire more and more people for that. We can't just double the size of a class. So your podcasting 101 class, which has 15 students, if we turn that into a class of 100 students, yeah, we might save money, but it'll be a lower experience for the students. And we usually don't do that. To go back to your question, are there too many students in higher education? Well, in a sense, we realized that in the year 2012, and we stopped. The total amount of students enrolled in American higher education peaked in 2012 and has gone down every semester, every year since. Now, there's two big reasons for that. Do you know the for-profit sector for higher ed?
Yeah, Coursera and other substances.
Well, yeah, Coursera is one example, but kind of not really. I'm referring to our colleges and universities that are run by companies for shareholder value. There's a lot of these, maybe several thousand. There's a great book on this by Tressie Cottom called Lower Ed. You think about, say, University of Phoenix.
The scummy ones.
Oh, some of them are scummy. Yeah, yeah. But it's a huge sector, and it grew starting in the 90s, and it enrolled many students, especially people of color, especially women. And starting around 2008, that sector began to collapse. The Obama administration did some great work in regulating them. The reputation collapsed, and that whole sector just has really shrunk in a lot of ways. Now, in many ways, that's progress. We can think, okay, if some of these were scummy, we got past them. Problem is, those students haven't gone anywhere else. They haven't gone to community colleges. They haven't gone to state schools. They haven't gone to liberal arts colleges. They've just been lost to higher ed. So ever since 2012, that population has gone down, and the community college population has gone down. Unemployment rates are usually the opposite of community college enrollment. So if you have high unemployment rates, usually the same. If you have high unemployment rates, community colleges get more and more students. It's a place to go if you're out of work, to get a job, to get skills for a job. But unemployment's been very, very low. It's been down to unprecedented lows, really, and that has taken quite a few students out of community colleges. So if you look at total enrollment in the United States, it's been going down ever since 2012. In fact, I published a gloomy piece about this called Peak Higher Education, where I asked, did we actually pass the peak? And that we may have done. We may have actually passed the peak. But your question may dive into a different topic or a different part of that, which is, are students going who shouldn't be going? So not just, are the schools scummy, or did they go for reasons that no longer apply, but should a student go if they're 18, they have no idea what to do with their lives, and they have no preparation for college? Is college a good fit for them? Is that what you're thinking of?
Yes and no. It's two things, really. So Switzerland and my wife is Swiss, and the Germanic countries have a different system, which is much more an apprenticeship or a higher education-based system, where about 80% will go through some type of apprentice-style system, and the top 20% or so will go to university, because most people going through the university are getting jobs that have almost, if not no, bearing to what they were working on. It was completely irrelevant what they studied, and not necessary. If I want to be a coder, I can go learn in a 3-month boot camp more than I'll learn in 4 years at university, more than I'll learn in a year working on my own, etc.
Sure. The apprenticeship model in Germany is quite fascinating. And I know it's deployed in Switzerland. A lot of European countries have been trying to emulate it or start emulating it. In the US, there's been some talk about this, especially in Rust Belt states. It hasn't gone very far yet, in part because a lot of companies, they'd really like to have higher ed take care of that training for them. They'd rather not have to spend more time helping that training process. Some of them do. Some of them will reach out. Some of them partner aggressively, either financially or in terms of credits. Some start up their own universities. You can think of like Motorola University, for example. Amazon has a huge, high quality internal training system, but in many ways, businesses want to rely on a BA or an MBA to tell them what they need to know to hire somebody, and then to move on. I think, it's possible that we have really overshot. If I talk to faculty across the country, almost every college university, I find people saying some of these students shouldn't be here. They shouldn't be studying French. They should be working in diesel technology, or they're just too immature, or they haven't had the training or the preparation, and they should go somewhere else. Problem with that, it may be true for individual people. One problem with that, though, is that 95% of American higher education institutions are dependent on tuition to come in. So if a given college or university says, yeah, we've admitted too many students, we should shrink our class from, say, 10,000 to 8,000, that's a huge revenue hit. And most of these operate in very, very tight margins. That's really, they're not incentivized to do that. It's, it can kill a college to have that. I mean, we often hear about some place like Stanford or Harvard, which has a huge endowment. Those are statistically outliers. I mean, they're really extraordinary. The typical school is more likely to be University of Georgia system, where you are right now, or community college system there. And so for them, they're predicated on teaching whoever walks in the doors. Usually, they have open access. So, I mean, it's possible that we may decide in the next 1 to 10 years that we have overshot our demand for higher education, that we need to not have so many people taking college classes. It may be, what's his name? There's a TV star who does Tough Jobs.
Mike something or other.
Yeah. He argues that he's not the only one. He's just one example of this. Who argues that we have many, many skilled trades that people can start working on at age 16 and don't need any post-secondary credit for. So
that a robot will not automate in the near future either.
Well, I'm getting to that. But right now, you think HVAC, you think plumbing, you think carpentry, you think electricians work, and a lot of that, yeah, we can't automate that very well yet. That's stuff that is too complicated. It involves a lot of knowledge, but it's knowledge that you learn on the job. It's knowledge that you learn by planing wood and by going into people's houses and trying to solve the puzzle of their water. It's possible that we'll have a cultural turn towards that. I mean, it may come from the right as Republicans get more and more upset at higher education. And now, in the age of Trump, they valorize the working class. They may say, all right, we don't need to support universities and colleges so much. Instead, maybe we should tell students at high school, don't do college prep. Just leave and start working at the local woodworkers, and you'll enter the middle class in a few years and have no college debt. Well, that's a great thing. We could have that turn. It's something I've been tracking pretty closely.
The hardest thing is the parents, because parents are pushing kids, oh, you've got to go to college because yada, yada, yada. It's A, what they've heard, and B, the competition with Johnny's parents.
Oh, exactly. And that competition is fierce. And so if you're talking about traditional age college students, teenagers, right, their parental pressure can be very intense. In fact, do you know the economist Bryan Kaplan?
I know the name.
Yeah, he's a wonderful person. He's a great guest, by the way, just as a suggestion down the road. I had him on my program, and he was just wonderful. He has a recent book, which is a very, very cynical look at higher education, where he argues that the entire value that we assign to higher education is based on the diploma, not on the learning. And he makes this case in great detail by saying, that a lot of learning in that 4 years or however many years is often forgotten, that what businesses and governments and nonprofits value is what's represented by that 4-degree diploma or that 2-year diploma or the MA or the PhD. And last week, during the college admissions and athletics crisis, he had a great piece in Time where he said, yeah, did all those rich people, do they corrupt the system in order to get Susie into Harvard because it has a great math program? No. They got them there because of that value, that cachet of having a Stanford, USC, Yale degree. That's the whole glory is part of that. So in a lot of ways, college student parents are competing for that. But the problem is they're trained on a cultural moment that has passed us by. What year were you born, Mark?
I was born 1991.
Okay, and I keep wanting to call you Mark, but it's Matt. I'm sorry.
That's all good.
One of the things that happened in the 90s was that we had this cultural shock. We had the sense that industry is leaving the U.S. We're still manufacturing stuff, but it's going to be done largely at scale, largely by robots. That what we're going to shift is we're going to shift the whole workforce from a manufacturing labor force to a knowledge economy. And so in order to do that, we have to get people skilled up. We need to make them more knowledgeable. We have to prepare them to work as, say, podcasters or futurists. And we really did a lot of work to do that. And the problem is that only came true halfway in terms of capital flows. Knowledge industries made a ton of money. I mean, you think about Apple, for example, one of the biggest companies in human history. The problem is they didn't employ a lot of people. In fact, most Americans shifted out of the labor section of manufacturing and into service. So the typical American worker is not a knowledge worker. It's not a manufacturing worker. It's someone who works at a grocery store as a clerk. It's someone who drives a bus. It's somebody who teaches yoga. The service sector is the leading part of our economy right now. And for how many of those jobs do you need a college degree? For how many of those jobs is a college degree overqualified? I mean, we have to go through a cultural reckoning to figure out what is the reality. But that's already going to be too old because, as you mentioned, automation is happening, and automation is changing these things really, really quickly.
You brought up healthcare earlier and the bubble that was brewing there. It's absurd. We pay twice as much. The U.S. actually is the third leading country in terms of governmental spend on healthcare, although we don't have a governmental healthcare system. Most people don't realize that.
Right.
But which bubble pops first, higher education and the fact that the jobs just aren't there for the costs people are paying, or healthcare?
Well, maybe that, I mean, American politics is pretty crazy right now, but it may be that within a decade that we push for Medicare for all. It may be, we elect President Sanders in 2020, or it may be the next generation, your generation of politicians. Maybe we have President Ocasio-Cortez or whomever, and that will take care of that bubble, I think. I mean, all the economics is pretty clear that a national healthcare system usually gets better values. And our experiment in the U.S. with private healthcare has pretty conclusively proven that while it had some good effects, it's much more costly and has a lot of problems. So that could happen within a decade. I mean, but education itself, that might pop first. I mean, I mentioned that decline of enrollment ever since 2012. If that keeps going, I mean, people are going to view this period as the downhill slope of a peak. It may be that the bubble popped not as dramatically as the housing bubble did in 2008, but it popped nonetheless.
How do we replace higher education for the future? I know one of the things you brought up, which I thought was very smart, was the focus of higher education towards older audiences. One thing that I've seen that is fascinating for me is taking retirement age people and having them live on campus with students, because that helps them live longer. They can study, they can learn and have experiences, and also helps the younger students get a little bit more of a perspective. Is that the future, some type of merging of these two?
It's one I've been arguing for about a decade, and it's starting to happen in the U.S. Arizona State University, for example, has this new project where they have a dorm. I'm sorry, they don't call it a dorm. It's incredibly expensive, and they call it something like residential housing. But basically, it's a dorm where you can move in if you're a senior. And if you do that, then you get to, as you said, spend time with young people. You get to go to any classes. You get to take in any films or performances or exhibits. They encourage you to be a docent in museums and that kind of thing. It's a great idea. I think we should see more and more of that. Rollins College in Florida, Winter Park, Florida, has this nice program where they have, for senior citizens, they can take a first-year undergraduate experience. So, Rhetoric 101, great books, Biology 101, that kind of thing. And it's a big hit because you have lots of retirees who either they're worried about their brains and memory issues, and they want to keep pushing learning for that. It may be that this is something they've dreamed about doing their whole adult lives but never had the chance to do. It may be that they're bored. It may be that they're new change of life and they're very curious. I think a lot of higher education has to pivot in that direction. I mean, see, this is one of the great things, Matt, is that we're living in an incredible success story in terms of our population. I mean, for the past century or so, we've done things like we've improved public health, we've made breakthroughs in medical technology and treatment. Above all, we've embraced the education of women. And all these things combined mean that we tend to have fewer kids and later in life. And as a result, the overpopulation fears we had in the 60s and 70s are really backing off. There's a new book about this, which has a kind of exalted title of Empty Planet. And that's an actual concern now. If you go to Japan, for example, or parts of Northern Europe, where the proportion of the population who is of working age is starting to shrink, and they're actually concerned. I mean, how do you run an economy when most of it, or not most of it, but a good chunk is retired? So, this is it may be that we have to think of education as a lifelong process. We've said this in education for a long time. We use the slogan lifelong learning, but we may actually have to really mean it. So, at 18, maybe you go down to a community college and you study for 2 years and you get a degree in, say, drone managing. And then you do that for 10 years. And then you say, well, I'm actually kind of interested in music. So part-time, you take a class from Stanford. Maybe it's entirely online in music performance. And then you spend half your career, now half the time, playing music and still managing drones and doing that on the side. And then years later, you decide that you really, really want to work on healthcare, that health means a lot to you. So you start a biology degree from scratch. I mean, we could have these like learning episodes where we check in on higher education throughout our lives. That's a very, very different model than the I'm 18, I go away to a 4-year undergraduate institution and get a degree and donate for the rest of my life. It's a very different degree. It's a very different model. And it's one that I think we should really explore carefully.
It's a different world. Kids these days will have 5 to 12 careers over the course of their life.
And often overlapping or simultaneously. Yeah. I mean, I show my kids Mad Men, and they think it's hilarious. It's like watching Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's a completely alien world, as it is to a degree for you as well. And they, one of the things that strikes them is the idea that you could have one job, one career, one employer for life. I mean, that's just that's science fiction for them. Instead, you have multiple careers, multiple jobs, multiple employers, sometimes at the same time.
So you brought up the fact that the aging population could be a problem. How much of that is actually a problem, and how much of that is the problem of us having GDP as the end all be all of all godliness in terms of the metric that we track?
Well, it's really hard to get past GDP. People have tried ever since GDP was invented, and we haven't really come up with a good metric yet. And we know all the problems with GDP. I mean, it doesn't measure some things that it should. It doesn't measure a lot of home work, domestic work. It's a fudge in many ways, but no one has accepted a replacement yet. And there are tons of replacements out there. It has the other problem that we tend to view economics as the end all and be all of life.
Exactly. That was my point. If the GDP is not going up, it's either staying stagnant or going down.
Right. And that's it's trivial to find out how much that misses of life. I mean, my PhD is in English literature. That's not a money-making proposition, but it enriches my life. I like to think it enriches the lives of my readers and my students, and some of them agree, and that's wonderful. But it's hard to measure that. It's hard to account for that. So, do we account for happiness, for example? It's tricky. And within higher education, there are a lot of people who will say things like, we shouldn't run higher education as a business. That we should look for non-financial outcomes, that someone should be able to go to college and study something that has no monetary benefits whatsoever, but makes their life better. I think we may see a return to this once automation really begins to take hold. I mean, so I think there's two possibilities here. One is that we could see a world with widespread unemployment and underemployment. I mean, there have been hints of this since 1990 or so, where, I mean, we tend to make more money with automation, but make fewer jobs. I mean, there was this great stat when when Kodak went out of business in New York State, there was something like 40,000 people unemployed as a result. And that week, Instagram had, I think, 500 employees. It's possible that we'll just have fewer and fewer people working and more machines doing work, in which case, one of the purposes of higher education shifts. Is it to give people ways of living when they're not on the job?
What about paying people to study?
Some colleges do this. They give generous stipends and they don't charge tuition. You'll see this in Europe, for example. And it's possible that we might do this. Right now, though, I think the cultural climate in the U.S. is opposed to that. We really we don't like paying people if we can help it. And higher education is still financially in such a mess that it's really hard to make a case for that.
Do you think that inevitably the US is screwed because here it's not a team sport? And going into the future, if we are going to have a world where there is more and more automation displacing jobs, it has to be viewed as a team sport. Otherwise, it's kind of taking Sally out back and shooting her in the head. in a sense, people don't want to say it. I had another guy on the program. I can't remember his last name, Bryan something. But he was bringing up the point of he was designing space stations in Mars and looking at the concept of what happens when you have someone that's living there with you that's not pulling their weight, because they are pulling their oxygen. What's the point where you have to put him outside the enclosure and let him suffocate himself because he's taking everyone else down? Well, how do we think about that if we're not on that team ship mentality, is it bulletproofing the Teslas?
Oh, that's a great question. And we will start bulletproofing Teslas pretty quickly, I think. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable for the past 10 years is that nobody shot a banker. No one's beaten to death a regulator. I mean, we had the worst financial crash in nearly 100 years in American history, and we let people skate.
Bonuses, no less.
Yeah, we didn't prosecute anybody except Madoff, who doesn't count. I mean, it's really it's astonishing. I think part of American culture is very interested in punishment, very vindictive, very interested in individual accountability, and that's one part of our culture. But at the same time, we're also, I think, very forgiving. We are willing to grant a lot of people, depending on their status, a second chance. You can think about, for some people, the origin of this is Iran-Contra, which should have disabled George Bush the first from being president. Instead, we elected him almost twice. You think about how the intelligence community completely failed on September 11th, and no hearings as a result of that. You think about.
I think we give a second chance to the people we look up to, but to the ones that we look down on, we would never consider a second chance. What do you say to that?
I think that's often true, but it also depends on if we look down to people, because we still love underdogs. I mean, this is a classic dilemma in America. We're a republic that lowercase r republic, that believes in individual people. We believe in the little guy. We believe in the underdog. We like that. At the same time, we've never shaken our love of aristocracy. I mean, we have this huge cult of celebrity that's just insane. I mean, it's really extravagant. And we love aristocratic families. I mentioned Bush, right? We have the Bushes, we have the Clintons. We really do love our hereditary aristocracy. And I think as income inequality and wealth inequality continues to escalate and get steeper and steeper, those two cultural attitudes will just keep bouncing back and forth, where we'll have, people who adore, Bezos or Carlos Slim or whatever comes out of Hollywood. And then we'll have people who think, no, this is wrong. We should support the lower. But yeah, if usually, if you are more photogenic, if you are whiter, if you are from certain geographical regions, yeah, we're more likely to give you a second chance, a second pass. I don't know if we're going to become more lifeboat oriented. There's a wonderful, wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell. I recommend it to every human on earth. What she does in this book is she looks at terrible disasters. She looks at horrible crises like Katrina. And what she identifies is people not thinking like a lifeboat, not chucking people out, not turning to Mad Max style dystopia, but instead helping each other out, doing mutual aid, being generous, self-organizing to keep a human community healthy and growing. I mean, it's one of the most optimistic books I've ever touched in my entire life. And I think she's a great writer in general, but this is one that's really extraordinary. So it may be, looking ahead, what happens to the person who clings to their job as a truck driver, right? Because it's automating trucks makes all kinds of sense for all kinds of ways. So what do we do with that John Henry style truck driver? I mean, some people will say, well, fire him, get rid of him, drag on the system, and he can go back and retrain. I mean, that's the Democratic Party's position. That's their attitude towards the Rust Belt. People can be retrained. Usually doesn't work. And so some people might say, well, gosh, maybe we should support him. I mean, GoFundMe. Maybe we should set up more crowdfunding to keep people alive from automation. If there isn't such a thing right now, we've just invented on this program. So congratulations.
And what happens when the first truck driver drives his truck into something as his way to off himself? We have another big problem.
Well, there's precedent for that. I mean, the Luddites are very interesting historically. They're not that well understood, but this idea that the technology renders you obsolete, so it should be destroyed, or they should be destroyed, or they should destroy themselves. I mean, if you look at Russian history in the 1990s, you had this huge collapse in mortality. You had lots of people, especially men, who killed themselves or died under what looks like suicidal circumstances. Lots of men who would just drive off the road or be found dead, having drunk all night outside on a Wednesday or on a February morning in Moscow, because they're heartbroken by the collapse of their system, by the collapse of their dream, the collapse of the system that supported them as well at times. And so we may have, a massive conflagration of people who are out of work. I mean, say bank tellers, hasn't happened yet, but grocery store clerks or forklift drivers. I mean, all these positions that can be automated what will people do? And there may be protests. I mean, that's one explanation of the 2016 presidential election. It's controversial, but people still say is that you had a lot of people voting for Trump out of economic terror, that they'd be out of work. And we have that roiling moment of cultural disturbance that could come up. Now, the other model of this, though, I mean, the historical model for 200 years is whenever we invented a new technology, it's thrown some people out of work, it's ended some professions, but it's grown more new ones. So you're in Atlanta, right? So in the summer in Atlanta, it gets pretty hot. Well, the way we used to, we had this wonderful job, a whole ecosystem in the 1800s, that people would cut ice out of lakes and rivers in Connecticut and New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont. And they would put it in ships and sail it down to South Carolina, Atlanta, and Florida, so you guys would have ice. There's a whole business, a fascinating business, really, just to look at. I mean, the historical photos are amazing. And we stopped that because we invented refrigeration. Wow, terrible news for the whole ice industry. Bad news. But we grew a bigger industry that employed more people. That's usually the pattern. So it may be that we create new jobs. So, say a podcast manager, job that wouldn't have existed in 2003. We can imagine that now. Or artificial intelligence ethicist, which we're starting to grow right now. But I think what's more likely is that we will see jobs become more and more cyborg jobs. Some will involve literal cyborgs, where you have implants in your body. But I think it's more and more that to do your work, you will have to work with AI and with other technologies. So, I mean, right now, we see this in elections. Election consultants have to work with incredibly powerful data managing tools, as well as mapping tools. You're doing your job right now, podcasting. I mean, in a sense, you're an oral storyteller with, using all kinds of technology to make that work. I mean, think about job after job, how much will require interacting closely with big data, with different hardware, different software. I think that's where higher education comes in. We help prepare students for a cyborg future.
I like to, when someone brings something up, to go to the extreme. And I think in this situation, it's prescient and also sad. If tomorrow suddenly we automated away all jobs and our lives become pure bliss, we were able to manufacture whatever we wanted without human labor, we'd all kill ourselves because none of us, better yet, we'd all go to kill someone else and steal their shit because we wouldn't have anything, because we wouldn't have any type of income coming in, because none of us would be collectively willing to support the other. And it's kind of a utopian dystopia. Is it not?
You just described two different worlds. One is utopian, one is dystopian. In Britain, they often speak kind of tongue-in-cheek of fully automated luxury communism, which is just this great. I don't know if you've seen that phrase. It's just, if you think about it, this is the dream. This is the Jetsons' dream. We're actually much better than that. That, if people don't have to work, and we can set up the structures to provide them with sufficient income and support so they can live and live well, that's fantastic. I mean, that's a dream to realize. So that's one extreme. So let's put that on the table. Fully automated luxury communism. Push that out there. But then the other extreme is, well, everyone's out of work, and people are at best living on some meager combination of the dole. They're on some basic subsistence level thing that just keeps the wolf a few feet from the door.
No, what I'm saying is they're the same thing. So let's say we get to that point of automation. The problem being, let's say we can produce, we're not that far off from energy being almost free. Let's say we get to the point where we can produce as much as we want to. Factories are cranking these out, but because no one has any money to buy anything, we're mass producing shit to throw into a landfill, not giving it to people, because giving it to people would be redistribution, and that's against the American way. That's kind of what it feels like. It kind of feels like it would be the utopia if it could only escape the dystopia of who we are.
That's the story of utopias right there in a nutshell. There's been some jokes I've heard. Can we figure out a way to levy an income tax on robot workers to keep things going? One way your dystopia could play out is that we have an elite who are the elite of the machines. The people who own the machines, the people who or own the services that support them. So you can think of Goldman Sachs, for example, offering financial support to every IPO for every company. You could think about, the companies, the owners of companies that do these things, and that the rest of us are basically peasants in the middle of a Silicon nightmare. This is one vision of dystopia that people are terrified of. And you can find this in science fiction. People think, how do you maintain a society like this? You have to figure out some way of either tranquilizing the population or terrorizing the population. So, and we can be tranquilized pretty well. And you think about, imagine Americans if we have a combination of some basic minimum income, however that's set up. We have some basic access to healthcare, not very good, but some basic access. We have lots of computer games. We have lots of online pornography, and we have cat videos without end. Is that population likely to rise up and demand expropriation of the digital masters? Possibly not. That's one. The other is terror, and we have all kinds of ways to terrorize people. We have massive amounts of surveillance. We have fantastic technologies of war. In fact, one of the great stories of automation that almost nobody talks about is the increasing automation of warfare. Right now in international law, there's a serious intellectual problem, which is who's responsible when an automated drone takes out the wrong person or blows up the wrong building. It's like an old philosophy question, but now it's a very practical one. Who do you sue? Who do you put in the dock? So we could terrorize a population so that they just don't want to revolt. I think there's a wonderful book by Peter Fraze where he talks about futures of automation, and these are two that he describes and wants us to avoid, and wants us to think now in the present. How can we avoid that? I think we'd have to have a kind of cultural reckoning where we rethink ourselves as social beings. I think Solnit's model helps us a lot in this. I think in extremity we tend to help each other. I think more than we tend to name each other. But right now, escalating inequality makes that really, really difficult. So far, America is generally speaking pretty okay with growing something like an aristocracy.
It's not just okay; it's vaunted. It's looked up upon.
I'm saying okay is the average. We have a left of, say, Bernie Sanders, but then we also have the right that celebrates it, as you said. You think about lifestyles of the rich and famous, or just the huge celebrity culture which really values this. Or you think about how often now we are looking to celebrities or very rich people, usually both, to run for office. Right? Oprah for president. Right? We want William Bloomberg for president. It's almost like a cartoonish version of the 1890s. You start to see the Monopoly man come out and wink and nod and become governor. But we have to. I think this is a time to rethink that, and it may be that climate change is one way that makes us rethink it. Climate change is so systematic, so holistic, so totalistic, that it's not enough to say, I've got mine. It's not enough to admire a banker who has a fantastic fortified compound up in the Appalachians or up in the Adirondacks, safe from floods. The systematic nature of climate change, the interconnected nature of this requires us to rethink. And if we take climate change at all seriously, that may be the spur for making us rethink our attitude towards each other.
I had a dream last night, and Bezos was in the dream. He was dressed up in this real white, evil suit with these reddish eyes, and he was just pure evil, and he had a bunker built on Mars. And I bring this up because I feel like we have this divergence between wealth, the haves and have-nots, in terms of people moving towards sustainability and people moving away from it. Bezos has argued he's basically said we should implement UBI because he's basically saying, checkmate, I'm going to win. And it certainly looks that way in a lot of ways. Is there a way around this? And if we did reach a stage where suddenly automation came on us faster than we expected, things were exponentially faster, would Europe and Northern Europe and possibly China be the only ones who could really handle it because they had cultures that were at least adapted enough to handle helping someone else out?
Well, keep in mind that even while we are hyper-individualized, we also do have many structures for helping each other out. A lot of America is a very religious country. We have quite a few religious organizations that do a lot of philanthropic work and a lot of community work. I don't belong to any myself, but I mean, sociologically, I can observe them. We have many as well, other organizations that help, everything from the unions that survive to civic organizations. And I think we may see more of them. But I do wonder how we rethink the value of a human being. And this goes back to your GDP question. I mean, do we value the true depth and complexity of an individual as someone who we should respect and support? Or do we turn them into an object? I mean, there's a great science fiction writer whose novel's been turned into many movies, named Philip Dick. And one of his great themes was the human capability of empathy. And how can we treat people like people? For him, the figure was the robot. When do we treat people like robots, a thing to be used? And when do we act like robots? When we treat people without empathy? I think other countries have other ways of proceeding. We haven't talked much about China, but China has developed this new system that is taking the world by storm. This combination of 20th century capitalism and communism, this interesting hybrid of 21st century surveillance with some form of 20th century representative democracy built in. I mean, it's this complex fusion that we don't really have a name for. And it's starting to spread because their influence is starting to spread through, their One Belt, One Road initiative. That's one option for the future. I don't know how stable it is. It's not one that I find personally attractive, but it's hard to deny its enormous success. I mean, one of the great stories of the past 30 years has been the enormous boom in China. Its elevation of people out of poverty into the middle class. In terms of higher education, they have built more universities and colleges than any civilization in human history has to date in less time. Just a huge growth. I mean, it's really amazing to look at. But I think, you asked when we were preparing for this podcast, you asked before what people should be thinking of. I think one thing to do is to pay careful attention to science fiction. And we don't do it enough. But science fiction has been thinking hard about this. I mean, since the beginning. You look at Frankenstein, and one of the great themes of that is how do you treat a creation, and how do you treat other people? I think we have to really listen hard to science fiction to try to figure out what it's been teaching us. There's a fun book from the early 1970s, crazy idea of science fiction. It's called The Shockwave Runner, and in the future, people are connected by computers. They're connected by telephone lines. People have virtual communities online. Bad programmers called hackers write programs that crash each other's programs. Pretty good. Pretty prescient. I think we need to keep a closer eye on SF to learn more.
Should that be something that's forcibly put into schools and replace? If so, what?
Well, I would always like to see SF in schools.
Actually, we could just put that into English. You just get rid of some of the classics and you replace it with things that.
It's hard. It's hard to. I mean, there's still a lot of cultural resistance to it, especially from older people. They were raised to treat science fiction as something that's embarrassing, something that's tawdry. I think it's come closer and closer to the mainstream, but we're not fully there. But yeah, I think. This is what futurist thinking does. Futurist thinking teaches you to do the kind of scenario development that you just did, talking about the future in a different way, how the future could be different from the present. I had a good friend who worked at a small college where he went around to all the professors and asked them, how is this college going to be different 40 years from now? And the supermajority of them, like 85% of them, said, this can be the same size, teach the same subjects, same kind of students. Yeah, unchanged. We have to get out of that frame of mind. We have to think more boldly. Here's an example. I keep coming back to the theme of escalating income inequality. And you quite rightly mentioned the fact that American healthcare is a mess. Well, one of the interesting side effects is that now, biologically, we're starting to see the signs of a difference in Americans. If you are born wealthy and remain wealthy, you tend to live a very, very different biological life. You are less likely to be afflicted with certain illnesses and even accidents. You're going to live much longer. People are that's a subtle and creepy thing to think about. Did you ever read The Time Machine, the Great H.G. Wells novel?
I didn't, but it's 10 years difference between the top 10% and the bottom 10%.
10 years. Think about that.
We haven't started genetic engineering yet, which I think will be an accelerant of that.
Absolutely. I mean, who gets to afford genetic engineering, right? And by what abilities? I mean, this is the scandal of the admissions and college athletics scandal I mentioned before. I mean,
that's nothing.
Right. In part, it's not a scandal. I mean, who was it? I think it was Dr. Dre said, "Oh yeah, my daughter got into college on her own merits." Did you hear this story?
No.
And he gave that college a $7 million donation. He just forgot to mention that. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to think about. So in the time machine, the far future, I mean, the far future, it's almost a million years in the future, humanity is developed into two completely different species, and they're basically cartoonish versions of workers and owners. The Morlocks and the Eloys. Book's only like 110 pages, public domain. Grab it. It's astonishing to read in so many ways. But if we're at that stage now, are we ready for that? I mean, are we ready to admire people who are more beautiful, stronger of limb, fairer face because they've had the biological power, the healthcare power for that? Are we ready for this? Parts of American culture would embrace it. We have to think hard about this. There's a fantastic economist, Thomas Piketty, who has his great work, Capital of the 21st Century, and he points out that something weird happened in the 20th century that we don't really realize how weird it was. From around 1914 to about 1950, we destroyed huge amounts of wealth in the world. With two spectacular world wars, we had the Great Depression. These were all global affairs. And during that process, we also reconfigured our societies so that we had, in the US, we had the New Deal, in Britain, national health care, in the Soviet bloc, the former Soviet socialism. And so from about 1950 to about 1980, roughly, we were the least unequal we've possibly ever been economically.
Possibly ever will be.
And that's Piketty's dark conclusion, because starting around 1980, we reversed that trend. And right now, 2019, we are somewhat around like 1900, 1910 levels of income inequality. A Swiss bank published a report a couple of years ago where they referred to our time as the new Gilded Age. And they're a Swiss bank; they're not complaining here, right? I mean, this is advice for their bankers. So, are we just back to the normal, state of affairs? If that's the case, then we just might accept seeing, people who have that kind of biological power, that kind of difference. Let's go a little further. Your dream was Bezos, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and he had a colony on Mars, right? So, who gets to go into space? I mean, in the 1960s and 70s, it was a very meticulously derived elite, a combination of scientific background and military background and all that. But we've already had a couple of millionaires fly into space. Maybe that becomes the elite. I mean, we have to think about where this could take us. And then when we look at elementary schools, there was a piece in Bloomberg about a week ago that had this great story about private kindergarten classes, and how some of the private kindergartens in New York cost $30,000 a year, and they were competitive. One of them mentioned they only accepted 10% of their students. Okay, or 10% of applicants, kindergartners. So what happens if from age 1 you are raised to be one of H.G. Wells's Eloy? Someone who's going to be surrounded with the best support. You'll have project-based learning. You'll have a freedom from surveillance. You'll have lots of interactions with people. And then a couple of blocks away, because that's how we do things in American cities, we will have the majority, the 99%, who are raised in surveillance, who are raised with more, perhaps, rote learning, more testing, who are aware of a culture of obedience around them. That's a grim picture. That's where I think in many ways education has the potential to blow that open. I mean, because when we have public education, people are forced to be in the same room together. When we have mass education, people have to learn together. That gives us a chance to expose them to possibilities of difference. That's what I have hopes for. I mean, that we can really, there's a brief moment in learning, if it's learning in front of your laptop, if it's learning in a classroom filled with 100 people, where you're devoted to the whole possibility of human imagination. That's a radical spot. And I think that's where I look for a lot of options for change.
For that kindergarten thing, when kids either come into pre-K or kindergarten, I'm not positive on the stat. The ones from lower income households have heard 30,000 less words over the course of their lifetime.
Right.
30,000. I just want to let that sink in. It's crazy.
Think about that. Think about that. I mean, that's a difference, and that's a difference that's built in right now. And so it's hard to treat that. It's hard to treat that because in America, as you mentioned before, we have the individualistic mentality. We have the sense of, you deserve what you're born into. And this is not a partisan thing. There's a lot of beliefs in New Age circles that if you get cancer, it's because you somehow invited it into you, which I always find breathtakingly inhumane. But we accept that in a lot of ways. Can we change it? There's a lot of pressure in education right now to change this, to try to have education revise the world. It's hard for educators to do. We have a lot of responsibilities, but it is one possible area for social transformation.
And no one gives a shit about teachers. No one's willing to pay teachers, even though they're the ones who bring the next generation into hopefully a better future. It's like teachers have to go on strike to have relatively living wages.
And isn't that fascinating? Because these were wildcat strikes organized through Facebook. I mean, these weren't, I'm not talking about the Chicago teacher strike from a couple of years ago, which was, went through normal channels. But, we're talking about West Virginia, we're talking about Oklahoma. I mean, these are teachers who were self-organizing. I mean, it's like something from the 1920s. It's really extraordinary. We may see more of that, but still, there's a lot of cultural baggage. There's a lot of cultural attitudes to change about that. A lot of K through 12 teachers, especially primary school teachers, are women. Whose economic value is usually downgraded. We don't take it as seriously. And also, I mean, we have other things that have happened as well. We've had homeschooling, which has been in many ways very successful. We've had many people homeschooled for decades now. We also have lots of options for online learning, some horrible, some excellent. We're really mixing this up. Speaking of mixing this up, I'm conscious of time, and I'm going to have to run in about 10 minutes or so. But I don't want to lose any other dreams you have or any other questions that you have.
I have one big dream to leave everybody with from the wise man with the incredible Gandalf beard. And that's if you had to leave people with one thing, a quote, a call to action, what would it be and why?
Imagine a different future and then see how you can get there from the present day.
And then multiply it or divide it by 10 because things happen so much faster and go so much bigger than you would ever expect.
They really can. They really can. We have the technologies to really have things go wide very, very quickly. Everything from mobile devices to the internet to really push things back and forth. And I think this is why, again, this is a special role for education, is to help people think this through. One of the slides I love showing people in education is of a riot. So I point out that if you teach students how to use technologies, they might not do the things that you like. And that's something, it's remarkable. It's like when the U.S. Invaded Iraq and put up a democratic system there. The government that hoped that the population would vote accordingly, that they wouldn't vote for the wrong people. It's weird when you give people choices, how they take those choices, and they might not be the choices you make. Parents know this all the time. So I think, in education, we have to really train the next couple of generations of people how to do this. But those generations are, to go back to our earlier point, also older people who are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. I mean, we can live, up to 100 in many ways now. I think if we have lifelong education, I think that gives us the chance to imagine something different and better.
The quote or the way I think about this is you're either living or you're dying. And I firmly believe that. Social Security was a scam when it was created because they realized people were dying like a year and a half after they retired because they had no purpose. When you stop learning, when you stop doing, when you stop living, you start dying. Bryan, thanks for coming today. This has been a lot of fun. Where's the best place for people to learn more about you and what you do?
Either go to futureofeducation.us, which will show you a bunch of my projects, or go to my blog, bryanalexander.org.
And of course, guys, we'll throw links and all that in the show notes. Thanks for coming today, Bryan.
Mom, my pleasure, man. Really great talking with you. Thank you so much.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this. If you have, remember, we could really use your support on Patreon, disruptors.fm/Patreon. And now we will talk to you guys again soon. Cheers. Awesome. That was fun.